So, we did a short segment on distributism a year ago.
Yes, yes.
But to be honest, I still don't really know that much about it. And so I wanted to do another segment on it, and I wanted to use this segment to learn about what distributism is and what it is not. So, first and foremost, again, Charles, could you please tell us what exactly is distributism?
I could. And let me recommend two books which you can get online to read. One by G.K. Chesterton called The Outline of Sanity, and the other by Hilary Belloc called The Servile State. Those are the two Bibles of distributism. Basically, distributism is the idea that in modern society, power has become concentrated in the hands of the very wealthy, political power. Now, I have to make a little explanation here, and that has to do with the difference between power and authority. All right? Important. Yes. Power is the ability to make things happen. Authority is the right to say what ought to be done. So, in other words, your doctor has the authority to tell you what you should do. You have the power to make it happen. He doesn't have the power, but he has the authority. You have the power, but you don't have the authority. You see?
Okay.
Now, in government, then, in any society, power, of course, is wherever it happens to be, and authority, the legitimate means of determining the direction a society should go, is very often a separate thing. So in the Middle Ages, to give you an example, and it's an important example because distributism gets a lot of its inspiration from the medieval manner of doing things, authority was very much concentrated in the church and in the crown and the king. The king, in fact, derived his legitimacy and his authority ultimately from God via the church. This is expressed through all sorts of rituals like the coronation and so on. But power was very diffuse. That is, it was divided up in a lot of areas. The church had some, the nobles had some, the cities had some, even the peasants had some. It was all over the place. The good king was like an orchestra leader, and he used his authority to try to get the various powers of the state to operate in something like the cohesion for the sake of a very important phrase, the common good. That's a phrase that has to be borne in mind, the common good. Now, in our society, as Belloc and Chesterton and other people of that era, authority had become very diffuse, that is to say, amongst the electorate. But power had become very concentrated in the hands of the very wealthy. And this extended to political power. So they were of the belief that the way forward, because this particular setup had led to the rise of Marxism and socialism and things like this, and also to the secularization of society, that they believed the way to combat this was to break up that power once more into smaller bits, and that meant small businesses, small farms, etc., as opposed to large corporations and large agribusinesses. Now, at the time that they were writing, there were a number of countries in Europe that still had something approaching that setup. France, for instance, had a lot of small farmers, and a good chunk of the French population was still on the land. So, I mean, it wasn't as though they were simply looking at the past. They were also looking at things that was still in their day.
Well, yeah, I mean, because the Servile State was written in 1913.
1912.
Or 1912, excuse me. And the breakup of Standard Oil, which is John D. Rockefeller's, situation, occurred in 1911.
Yes.
So, isn't distributism? I always assumed it was a response to the robber barons during the time.
Well, the equivalent in Europe and England, but yeah, I mean there was a lot. Teddy Roosevelt, for instance, in this country, or I should say that country, since I'm in Austria. Ha ha ha. But Teddy Roosevelt was a great crusader against the trusts, as they were called. And these were groups of basically companies that stopped competing with each other. They basically turned their given industry into a closed shop.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of this sort of thing going on at the time. There were a lot of people other than Justin and Belloc coming up with similar ideas, usually focusing on different elements of the problem. So you had the guild socialists, who were not really socialists in the sense of Marxists, but they believed in, alongside the corporatists, in organizing labor, capital, and retail of all the different industries and so forth, bring them together in a united body. I mean, there were just all sorts of floating around, and these ideas found some expression in the various papal documents of the time, all the way from Rerum Novarum in the 1880s under Leo XIII to Quadragesimo Anno of Pius XI. And they all called for a lot of the same things: small holdings, small this, small that. Small is beautiful, as Shoemaker said.
Okay. So you mentioned socialism. I guess the big question is, what does distributism in action look like? Like, would Teddy Roosevelt's trust busting the monopolies, is that distributism in action? Is also, obviously, he's using laws, right? He's using American laws. He's using the Clayton Act, the Sherman Act, the Federal Trade Commission Act. These acts were passed to handle these large businesses that had monopolies. Is this distributism in action, or
in a sense?
Okay, in a sense.
In a sense, I mean, the thing I bear in mind about distributism is that, not unlike capitalism, is that it was not really something that people, as opposed to Marxism, that people simply sat down and worked out as the end all and be all to every question. It was a very flexible thing because it was designed to adjust to local conditions, whatever those happen to be. So, for instance, in Nova Scotia, the fishing parishes at Cape Breton organized fishermen. See, basically, what you had going on up there was that you had these fishermen who had their separate boats, and they basically sold their fish for a pittance to the major factories. Well, with a bit of seed money from the church, they organized cooperatives, which started their own Fed and dealt directly with the markets. So they were able to run an end run around the major corporations up there and finding a living wage. So that was an example of distributism in action.
Okay.
They had other schemes like that in different places. The idea being, again, that to the highest degree possible, local businessmen, local industries, local farmers would do as much of their own work as possible. What we call subsidiarity today.
Okay. So are there graduations in distributism? I mean, do I have to want to live on the Shire? Do I have to want to be a farmer in order to be a distributist? No, I don't. No. That's a falsehood.
That's a falsehood. I mean, it's like saying if you want to be a capitalist, you have to be in favor of oppressing the poor.
Yeah,
it's crazy.
I had made an assumption that since there are various types of capitalists, that you don't simply assume that you're a laissez-faire capitalist, right? That so too, you don't simply assume that you're the most hardcore distributist there is, where everyone needs to be living, on farms and doing subsistence agriculture.
No, and in fact, a distributist would say, well, for example, one of the very distributist things that you'll see these days is a thing they call Shop Local Saturday.
Where you're
encouraged.
Love that.
Yeah, well, that's distributism, where you're encouraged, rather than going to a chain store, to go to your local mom and pop shops.
Yeah.
A lot of what's called the new urbanism, resettling rundown portions of a city and making it bloom again, like what they've done with downtown Cleveland comes to mind. That would be very distributist. So I mean, it's a very difficult thing to describe, simply because there's so many different aspects to it. But to say that to be a distributist, you've got to favor, living in the is like saying to be a capitalist, you've got to favor Pittsburgh factories in 1920 and sweatshops with your workers working sundown to sunup.
You're against that?
Yeah, I really am. My great grandfather came down to New England to entertain mill workers. So yeah, I'm pretty much against that.
Okay. Okay. There's still so many more questions that I personally have about distributism and that I've heard elsewhere. So yeah, I've got a list of these. So we'll tackle these one at a time.
Another thing you could consider kind of a distributist thing in its way is the slow food movement.
Oh yeah, you've talked about this before.
Yeah,
I like that. It's hard though.
Me too. Oh, of course, distributism of this sort is very hard. I mean, it can mean going to O'Reilly's corner store instead of going to Walmart.
Yeah.
So yeah, you may have questions in this area further on, but again, it's better for the community that you go to O'Flaherty's. It's certainly easier and cheaper in the immediate Walmart.
Okay.
So you have to make those decisions,
Yeah. Well, actually, for me personally, it's very easy for me to go to a local coffee shop or a burger joint rather than McDonald's or Starbucks. Like I like that.
See, one of the things you've seen all across this great country of ours. I love that phrase. All across this great country of ours. What you saw all through the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, you'd have a mall with various national brands outside of town, and the downtown would go to pot. The businesses will leave. And one of the, again, very distributist things that you're seeing around the country today are all sorts of local initiatives to revitalize their downtowns, which have beautiful architecture, very often have buildings with features the quality of which we can't reproduce today.
Okay, so this doesn't sound like an alien concept that just a few writers in the early half of the 20th century had. It sounds like this is something that has occurred in our history very much at the top level and continues to happen to our day.
Yeah, well, I mean, it basically, it's the notion of the economy serving the common good and at the lowest possible level.
Okay, see, that's one of the questions is we'll get to it, but that's going to be one of the questions that I feel is important. So firstly, the first question is, I want to know if I'm a distributist. Okay, so because I feel like a lot of people might have similar opinions. So let's unpack this.
All right.
I'm a guy who thinks there should be laws that favor small business and restrict corporations from artificially becoming huge, like through mergers and acquisitions, and thereby gaining monopolies. In other words, I want the legal system to prevent corporations from becoming tyrannical. I want strict enforcement of the antitrust laws on the books, the Sherman Act, the Clayton Act, Federal Commission Act. So what does that make me? Is that a version of distributism, or do there need to be other things, more hardcore things that I need to abide by?
Well, I would say that, again, you should try to shop locally, although, as you've indicated, it's easy for you to do.
Yeah.
But the distributist tries to do that. But there's more. I mean, just to give you an example, you look at the tax structure of so many of our northeastern states. which make it virtually impossible for young families to start out, at least start out owning their homes. And again, we've just gone through this terrible debacle of bad loans through the merger of government and finance. What we have is certainly not distributist. It could be called capitalist, I guess. Yeah. But as you said earlier, you'd have to define your terms. It's not laissez-faire. I don't know what you'd call it. Yeah. Crony capitalism? I don't know. What I can tell you, though, is that the distributists would be in favor of laws that favor families, the larger the better, favor the mothers staying home,
Yeah.
These are things that are very, very important to a society. Again, they serve the common good. Now, how we get there from here, that's another story.
Yeah.
Would it be in...
Yeah, see, that's the big question that seems to be on everyone's mind. Is distributism socialism? Does it need to have a Marxist stage in order to get, as you said before the show, from here to there, wherever there is?
Well, I mean, everyone has that problem. The laissez-faire capitalists have that problem. The libertarians have that problem.
How?
How do we get from here to there? For the libertarian, for instance, he wants to completely shrink the state to a minimum of existence. Okay, that's nice. How are you going to do that? It's not going to be voted in because all the people with entitlements will be against it.
Okay, what about the capitalist?
Well, same problem. If you're a laissez-faire capitalist and you're against government subsidies, you're in favor of a strict free market. How are you going to do that? How are you going to disentangle government from business? At the end of the day, the problem you have is that there is no easy way to get from where we are to where anyone who's not happy with where we are wants to go.
Okay.
There's just no easy way. So if you say, well, you'd have to have a Marxist revolution stage. Well, that would be true no matter what you want to do if it was different from what we've got. I'll give you an example. Let's say something much more much more modest than either distributism, capitalism, or libertarianism. Let's say that you wanted to replace the income tax and all of the intricacies that we're in tax season right now, so I'm sure this is on people's minds. Imagine if all of that was replaced with an across-the-board sales tax.
Okay.
This has been suggested by a lot of people. I didn't make it up. It's not original to me.
Right.
And it could be done in such a way that the government could be supported out of it, literally pennies to the taxpayer, or at the most a few dollars. It would be self-collecting and self-policing, so there'd be no more tax dodging. Sounds like a great idea, doesn't it?
Kind of.
Yeah, kind of.
I have some reservations against it.
There's a big problem, even if you were all for it, even if you thought it was the greatest idea since plaid paint.
What's the problem?
In terms of enacting it, well, you've got the monstrous creature we call the Internal Revenue Service.
Okay.
Think of all the people it employs. Think of all the political clout it has. You would basically be opposing the Internal Revenue Service.
Okay.
That's not a political battle anybody wants to fight.
Okay.
You can't, I mean, to try to fight the internal revenue would be political suicide.
Okay.
Now multiply that by all sorts of other problems if you wanted any kind of across-the-board reform.
Okay. I want to talk about, again, the question of there's so many other aspects to is distributism socialism that I want to unpack here.
First, let's define what we mean by socialism.
Okay, what do we mean by socialism? Yeah, that's a good idea. Let's define things.
Socialism, of course, is the idea that the government should own the means of production, and that they should administer these means of production for the good of the workers. The people, the class, so-called bourgeoisie, that formerly own the means of production, factories, the farms, and so forth, would be eliminated or end up stuck working on what they used to own.
Okay.
And that is what socialism is. Distributism is the opposite of that. It calls for the widest possible distribution of property amongst the largest number of people. You've got to remember that in socialist states, the government determines policy, etc., and physically owns the factories, the farms, which are usually organized as collectives and whatnot. But and the result, as we saw in the Soviet Union, a lot of other places, has been economic disaster, because the truth of the matter is people simply do not work very hard or with any care for things they don't own or have a stake in. It's called human nature. There was an old joke, and it wasn't a joke. There were warehouses in Siberia filled with thousands upon thousands of left shoes. They hadn't made any right shoes to match them. They just kept on turning out left shoes.
I heard that story.
Yeah. Now, whether or not it's true, it shows up the problem with socialism. But to call distributism socialism, you'd have to give me, it certainly isn't that.
Oh.
It's the opposite of that. So the question has to be, in what sense would you call distributism socialist?
Okay, here's one objection. Okay, distributism works by the government punishing any business as it gets popular and big, cutting it down to size, which would effectively destroy any domestic industry in short order. Now, I'd like to say something regarding that, because,
Sure.
Again, the question of distributism in action. When I see that quote, I think of what Teddy Roosevelt did to Standard Oil. And this was, it to me, unless I'm totally missing something, it did not destroy any industry. What happened in the breaking up of Standard Oil is that what was done was, it's called a divestiture, which is a sale of the investment, and it was dispersed or distributed among 7 different companies, I believe, and John D. Rockefeller was not stripped of his wealth. I looked it up, actually. His net worth, if you accounted for inflation, in 1913 was equivalent of $600 billion, which is, Jeff Bezos is, I think, around $120 billion. So that gives you an idea of, and because it wasn't about his personal wealth, and it wasn't about wealth at all. It's about spreading out the means of production. Now, again, is this distributism in action? Because to me, it looked like that was a pretty good job, like what we did there.
Well, it certainly looks like it, and I could give you a much more recent thing, and that was the breaking up of Ma Bell.
Yeah, and to the baby bells.
Yep. I mean, the prices went down. Technology in communications just started zipping.
And I have to say, because I have a neat story attached to this, actually, that in the sale of the company, it's a fair sale. It's a fair price. My grandma, actually, she had this old-timey stock certificate of AT&T. And we had this. We had got it out of the closet. We had found it. My dad told me this story, and so they cashed it in, and the result was she had all this ownership, this neat little ownership in 7 different companies, which all did quite well. None of them were like, oh no, you've destroyed our industry because you broke up this company. All of them are doing well, and actually, the daughters now of the actually, so it was broken up into 6 or 7 companies, and those companies now are AT&T, Verizon, and Quest, which are doing great. Also, some backstory of Standard Oil in terms of those companies and the daughters of that breakup. Those
Mm-hmm.
companies are now ExxonMobil, Chevron Texaco, BP, um, and Marathon Oil. I don't know Marathon Oil too well, but I can tell you the rest of those companies are doing pretty well. Actually, I read an investment book, and ExxonMobil is like their stock. They earn an extra 10%, 10% every year. Actually, great investment. So
Uh,
I don't see domestic industry being destroyed while sort of cutting down these monopolies down to size.
no, and of course, the other thing too is that if you're going to say, for instance, bearing in mind the agricultural interests, um, the one of the things they very much were against were great estates. Well, I don't know. I think a great estate has a lot to be said for it, but the if you can't very well call that by itself socialist unless you want to say the American Revolution was socialist. The reason being that when the war was over, the estates of the loyalists were broken up and given and sold to people. Revolution. Now, you could say, well, we're simply confiscating the property of traders. Well, that sounds a lot like what the Marxists would say about confiscations.
Yeah.
And then the people who had benefited the most from it, the great landowners in New York, like the Van Rensselaers, the Livingstons, and whatnot, in the 1820s, they had their great estates broken up by the courts in New York State. Did that make New York State socialist?
Yes.
Well, okay. All right, so the United States Socialist country of George Washington and Patrick Henry. Well, all right, fine. We got that out of the way. It is April Fool's Day. All right, we understand now. The other thing, one of the best examples of land reform I ever saw, which I didn't see it, I wasn't there, but I've ever studied, which I really, really liked, was, believe it or not, on Taiwan.
Oh, okay.
And nationalist China. And this happened in the early 50s, because what happened was that, you may recall that Taiwan itself had been a Japanese colony since 1895. After World War II, China gets it back, and then it becomes the last refuge of the Chinese government. They lose the Civil War. Well, virtually all the factories and that sort of thing in Taiwan had been owned by Japanese. And so they were confiscated by the Chinese government, which now own them. But the land in Taiwan was divided up amongst a few great lands. Well, not a few. They were pretty big estates. Most of them weren't all that profitable, but there they were. They had a problem in that these great estates were not producing a great deal in the way of agricultural products. And they had all of these refugees from mainland China to feed, to say nothing of the locals. So they needed to up their agricultural production. At the same time, they needed to stimulate the lagging industrial economy. So what did they do? Well, it was interesting. In order to stimulate agricultural production, they broke up the estates, all right, and the farmers own their own property, and immediately up went the production values in farms on Taiwan. But the landowners, instead of just being expropriated without compensation, were given shares in the formerly government-owned companies, which, remember, had been owned by Japanese, taken by the Chinese. So they gave keep control of these companies for landlords. Well, the landlords, of course, had a lot of experience in management. And they transferred their experience from managing large farms to managing these corporations. And the result on both sides, both on the industrial end, the agricultural end, was a big boom. You saw the same thing in Japan, when after the Meiji Restoration in 1867, a lot of the Japanese nobility got out of agriculture usually with some prodding from the government, and got into industry, the so-called zaibatsu. Moreover, in Ireland, and again, I don't think you'd call Japan or nationalist China socialist. Quite the contrary. In Ireland, it was an interesting thing because as a result of the Battle of the Boyne in 1690, most of Ireland was owned by Protestant landlords with Catholic tenants, and that particular setup didn't do very well during the famine, as you might imagine. Well, they had a brilliant idea, and that was, rather than seizing the property of the landlords, the British government helped subsidize the Irish farmer in buying the land that he worked. These are the famous Wyndham Land Acts. And they had the result of not financially destroying the Anglo-Irish on the one hand, but on the other hand, making the Irish farmer the owner of his own land and pushing agricultural production way up. So, and again, I don't think anybody would have called George Wyndham a socialist, although he was a friend of Belloc.
Okay. Okay, and bear with us, ladies and gentlemen. We have a host of objections. I want to leave no stone unturned here, so bear with us. I might even put timestamps to each sub-question on the summary. So refer to that if we're losing you on any issue, or you're more interested in other questions, because I really want to be thorough and comprehensive on this, because there are so many I think questions and potential objections on so many things. Now I think the biggest question that makes everyone uncomfortable, we're all wondering about, including myself, is what's the acceptable level of size of company? See, like for me personally, I just want to avoid like tyranny, as in like, I want alternatives. Like for example, like with this video, if you're not doing it on YouTube, there's kind of nowhere else to go. It's like you can go elsewhere, but you'll get like 5% of the viewers. That's kind of not good, I feel. And so that's the sort of situation that I don't think is ideal. But again, perhaps there are distributists who want everyone to be like a mom and pop type shop, and everything else gets leveled to the ground. Is that ideal distributism, where everything else has to be cleared away?
I wouldn't say so. I mean, the fact is that one of the great aspects of distributism, which was absolutely had to be the case, was its adaptability to local condition, which again was the genius of the medieval system. One size can't fit all. So when you ask what would be an acceptable size, well, it depends upon the business. It depends upon what we're talking about. If it depends upon fair advantage and what's fair. See, and this does bring us back to another issue, and that is once again the common good. Distributism cannot work without there being a basic, broad understanding that the economy, and this is directly from Catholic social teaching, that the economy has to serve the common good first and foremost.
Yeah.
Profits are important. And let me about that. I am very much against the diminution, the diminution of wealth for no reason. Why? Because the wealthy do all sorts of things that we don't think about. Museums, private schools, libraries. There are all sorts of, the arts, historic preservation. There are all kinds of things that cannot be done without a class of people with discretionary income.
Yeah.
It's very important to maintain. I mean, for instance, that's why I'm as distributist as you please, but I'm very much against rent control. Now, why is this? Because if you have rent control, two things are going to happen. Number one, because there'll be no real profit to be made over getting new buildings, people won't build new housing.
Yeah.
Number two, because there's no profit to be made, they're not going to repair existing housing. I've got a very good friend in New York. He and his wife the same apartment since the 70s in the village, the Greenwich Village. They pay like $350 a month. I'm saying $350. But if they want any repairs done, they have to do it themselves.
Yeah.
Because other than the bare minimum required by law, the landlord's not going to do anything because it's not really an investment. So, and what does this mean? It means that there's no new housing in that part of New York. It means you can't get, or if you can, it's a piece of garbage that's all outdoors. And of course, as soon as somebody's out of an apartment, they jack the rent up. Now, why am I mentioning all this? Because it goes back to the question of the common good. That's the big thing in distributism.
Yeah.
It would sound at the first blush that rent control might be a distributist thing to do. It's not, because it doesn't serve the common good. Because ultimately it prevents there from being new housing. It prevents existing housing, existing rental housing, from being properly serviced. Now, and also you can compare, if you like, the housing that's rental housing that's privately owned versus governmentally owned housing. And inevitably, governmental housing goes to hell. Why? Because no one's responsible for the upkeep. There's no one to say, put graffiti on your front door and you're out, you're evicted.
Yeah.
See, I mention all these things because we're talking about a huge range of human activities. They're all very, very complex. They're all very intertwined.
Yeah.
And it would be a mistake, I think, to simply take one set of them and say, oh, well, that's distributism, or that's capitalism, or even that's libertarianism.
Okay, let's get to some of these other objections. I apologize, ladies and gentlemen. Let's see. What policies would you need to implement distributism? I think we sort of covered that. Oh, here's an interesting objection. Distributists will define everything other than the right of possession. It's basically common property. What would you say to that?
Well, I would say that's not true.
Okay.
Again, distributists tended to be Catholic and as a result tended to follow the church's teaching in these things. There is commonality to the goods of the earth. Where do we see this? Where is this expressed? Well, an obvious example is the man who's starving and steals a loaf of bread from the baker. Now, that's not a sin. Why? Because the starving man's right of survival outweighs the baker's right to property. But notice very carefully, his starvation doesn't give him the right to take money out of the till.
Yeah, see, I guess opponents of that would argue it's a snowball effect. Like, where do you draw the line in that? You see?
Well, you use something, and I know it's a thing that's very, very difficult to bring to bear on any of this stuff, but I'll say it anyway. Use something called common sense. And that is to say,
okay.
I know. And it's April Fool's Day, worse yet. So I know. The very notion of you applying common sense rather than simply being doctrinaire is a little much, but we'll go with it. No, I mean, the fact of the matter is that we already have what is called eminent domain. Now, what is eminent domain? Eminent domain is the idea that for certain first things, the king can take back some of his property to build a lighthouse or a fort or a highway. And the United States, either the feds or the state or somebody, succeeded to the right of the king. And so we still have the law of eminent domain. Nobody disputes that. Now, mind you, distributists would very much be against how eminent domain has been expanded by the Supreme Court. First in the 50s, to allow the cities to condemn huge sections, to take them over and condemn them and knock them down and then do nothing with them. I can't think of anything a distributist would hate more than seeing whole neighborhoods just destroyed. And then the third element, Reno versus New London, which is adopted in the years, whereby the government becomes really the ultimate landlord. You just hold your property in trust until they can find somebody to pay higher taxes on it.
Right. Anybody who pays higher taxes on it, you can be ousted.
Yeah. There is not a distributist in the world who would not see that as an evil. I mean, and it's socialism.
Yeah, I was going to ask, is that socialism? So is that aspect of our country socialist?
Of course it is, because that is you go from a difference between things that are absolutely essential for the common good, and thus overcome your right to property, versus the government simply making a quick buck off its peons.
Okay.
There's a difference there.
Okay, another objection is the notion of a contract, a binding social contract between the government and the people in terms of ownership. You can't redistribute the property. What do you say to that? The notion of contract and how it's a violation of contract.
What's a violation of contract? Distributism?
Yeah.
Well, as we've just seen, I think,
we got some other problems.
That contract had been ripped up and put on the fire. They no distributors around it.
We got some other contract
we roasted marshmallows over that burning contract. All right, I'm sorry. I've got to put my false teeth back in. They fell out.
Okay, so I guess we have that covered, I guess.
Yeah, I think so. What else you got?
Okay, the questions posed to distributists: what is being distributed, and what's the deal with the use of force in Belloc? Belloc said you have to use force, so you need a coercive government.
Well, every government is coercive by definition. If it weren't coercive, it wouldn't be a government. That's why people go to jail.
Okay.
Yeah, well, they do.
I don't like to think of the American government as coercive.
No? You ever try counseling outside an abortion mill?
What?
Outside an abortion mill. Think of Operation Rescue. Them folks got themselves put into jail.
Well, that's government looking out for the common good.
Yeah, for the common good of the abortionists. And there's a good example. The distributists would say that the rescue people they were violating the abortuary's right of property for the sake of the infant's right to life.
Okay. So, what about the question, what is being distributed?
Well, what is being distributed, of course, are the means of production, land, etc.
If you're distributing, but then isn't that socialism? If you're distributing land, if the government is distributing land,
if it were, then as we said earlier, with the American Revolution, with the 1820 rent wars in New York, with Ma Bell and Standard Oil, we already are a socialist country. So what's the problem?
Sad.
We were socialist from the very beginning.
Sad. What a sad day.
No, the question was asked.
Okay.
Believe me, by the standard of socialism thrown at the distributists, the founding fathers, because they were all of confiscating loyalist property.
Okay, you need to be set straight, Charles, and Thomas Aquinas is going to set you straight. Because
oh boy, not again.
Thomas Aquinas is talking about distributism when he says it's a fundamental corruption of the polity to redistribute property among people and the family.
That's actually not what St. Thomas Aquinas was talking about. You remember, St. Thomas king was writing and speaking in the feudal era. Now, what was the basis of feudal ownership? There was a wide distribution of land, of course, with a certain number of great lords. And these great lords were in the position that I mentioned earlier, vis-a-vis the king. Thomas is again the king deciding for political reasons to scoop up a ton of lands, take them from people he opposed, and replace them with his cronies. Such as you saw in the War of the Roses, for that matter, Henry's dissolution of the monasteries. That was the sort of opposing, but that's not what the intend to do.
Okay.
But it's good to know then that if you're going to quote Thomas Aquinas, I guess you're in favor of feudalism, which you're really a distributist. All makes sense if you know how to twist your brain.
Okay, let's get to some of the fun ones. Let's get to some of these fun objections. I like some of these. Distributism is a nostalgia for a period that never existed.
Well,
that fits perfectly with you. You're the king of the LARPers.
Well, let's stop and think about this for a second, though. The people who are arguing for laissez-faire capitalism obviously aren't arguing for today. They're nostalgics for something. The era of the robber barons.
That's true.
The sweatshops. Pittsburgh belching forth tons of coal out of their pipes. People having to change their collars 3 times a day because the coal dust got them filthy. Is that what they're nostalgic for? And libertarians, they're nostalgic for what? I don't know. A time that never existed. And constitutionalists, what are they nostalgic for? Philadelphia, 38? I mean, come on.
Okay. And also,
they don't like what they have now. If you don't like what you got right now, if you think you've got a better system, I don't care what it is, then you're obviously a nostalgic, you're a LARPer, and you have no business commenting on anything. And that includes me. So there.
The last one I want to do is the most fun one, and it's a long-term gag that I've seen for many years. The gag is that distributists are sort of portrayed as these Tolkien fanboy LARPers who want to live in the Shire and live the life of a hobbit. Now,
okay.
I got to speak about personally for me. I'm sure the Shire's a nice place to visit, but I wouldn't want to live there. I'm not really like a farm and livestock kind of guy. I'll take the guided tour of Bag End. I'll have a drink with the gaffer at the Green Dragon Inn. Okay, and maybe, just maybe, I'll drink a little bit of, not drink, I'll smoke a little bit of Old Toby. And that's good enough for me. I'm done. I'm good. I had the Shire experience.
Well, having spent a lot of time in rural New England and rural Europe and the South, I have been to places that have been rather reminiscent of the Shire, frankly.
Really?
But having said that, I'm a big city boy myself. But I would ask if the opponents of the Distributists, I mean, it's a ridiculous thing to say. The Distributists want to live in the Shire. It's as though the opponents of the Distributists want to live in Pittsburgh in 1920. See the smokestacks belching out the coal smoke and the infant mortality rate and tuberculosis stalking everywhere in the slums. That's what they're looking for, which would be just as stupid. I highly doubt that any opponent of distributism really wants to live in Pittsburgh in 1920, even in one of those nice houses up on the hill.
You got something against Pittsburgh. Whenever we're talking about this, even for other things, you're always citing Pittsburgh as like the nastiest city there is.
It's not anymore. It's a very beautiful city now.
Okay, well, lay off Pittsburgh, will you? Actually, I don't mind you laying off Pittsburgh because my family, we come from Philadelphia, the nice side of Pennsylvania, okay? So
you shouldn't be giving me guff.
Yeah, sorry about that.
You know how they define Pennsylvania?
How?
Philadelphia and Pittsburgh separated by Alabama.
What? How does that work?
Well, the idea being that between these two big cities, you've got deliverance country.
Yeah, the Amish, I guess, right?
Oh, not just the Amish. I mean, they've got hill people, Scots-Irish types.
Whoa.
Oh yeah.
Okay. Wait a minute. Wait. Okay. I have to apologize for Charles because we actually get a lot of people right from there. I apologize to the Luthers. Okay, particularly because I know they're right from there, and I apologize
Listen,
to a
like,
lot of other customers, Tumblr House customers. Please don't take your business elsewhere because of this man's comments over here. Okay, he is not. He is no longer an employee of Tumblr House. He's a freelance contractor. Okay, so yeah. Okay, just.
all right. Firstly, that's one reason why I'm eating better. Secondly,
Okay.
secondly, some of my very best friends, the Mulls, live in Phillipsburg, PA. I know what I'm talking about. And here's a shout out to the Mulls, by the way, in case any of them are watching.
There you go.
No, I mean Pennsylvania even stole Erie from New York State.
Did it?
Yeah,
Wow.
they wanted to have an outlet on Lake Erie. A
Okay, so
lot of good that did them.
any last things on distributism? Are we all settled? Got
Well, I
everything
think
covered?
so. I mean, I have to say though, in light of certain developments over the past week or so, that in the minuscule tempest in a teapot world that is Catholicism, there's been a lot of jumping up and down and shrieking over distributism versus capitalism recently. Don't do that. You know, bear in mind that whatever your point of view and however strongly, number one, you're no more likely to be able to accomplish what you want to do than your opponents are. So it's kind of silly to be slitting each other's throats over it. Secondly, if you claim to hold what you hold in economics, politics, because of your religion, bear in mind that your co-religionists, although they may differ from you politically, questions of science or anything else, they are your co-religionists. And if you could sit down with someone who opposes you completely in economics or in scientific questions or whatever, and the two of you could both recite all four of the creeds and mean them, that's the question.
Yeah.
Other things, if we ever get to a point to where Catholicism is such a powerful influence in this country, that these questions become important, objectively speaking, then we can have at it.
Yeah.
But until that day, excommunicating people and above all denigrating their Catholicism because they don't agree with you on political points or economic points or scientific points or questions of fashion is just crazy. And it only benefits the enemy. It doesn't do the faith any good, and it doesn't do your soul any good.
And I personally don't think, maybe I'm totally wrong, but I don't think distributism and capitalism are totally at odds. I think you can incorporate a little bit. I mean, I'm mostly capitalist and a little bit a distributist as sort of a corrective on some of the excesses of capitalism. Is that fair to do, or is that unfair? I can't do that. I have to pick distributism or capitalism.
No, you basically got to live in the Shire in 1920 after Saruman took over.
Oh, man.
With
Oh,
the
after
pub- with
Saruman,
the
yeah,
Solstice. Yeah.
yeah, because Saruman's the ultimate distributist, right? He is the distributist. Tolkien, yeah, that's how it was.
Yeah,
Right?
that's right. That's sure.
Yeah. Um,
Actually, as far as Tolkien was concerned, he was the ultimate capitalist.
yeah, because the industry, right? The industry,
Yeah.
it mimics the factories and all that.
All that. So
The fires
I
of
mean-
industry.
So let's not go crazy, ladies and gentlemen. On a note, I'll close my remarks with some advice from the Rocky Horror Picture Show. Stay sane inside insanity.
Okay.